Welcome to part 2 of the Move Tool tutorials. As a reminder, the Move tools in Illustrator refer to these 4 tools located at the top of the toolbar. This time we'll be delving into what the Direct Selection tool and the Lasso tool do. Another term I like to refer to the Direct Selection tool as is the White Arrow tool. You may have noticed in the last video that objects selected in Illustrator tend to be made up of different points. Where the Black Arrow tool is able to move a whole object at a time, the White Arrow tool specializes in moving individual points. Similar to the Black Arrow tool, the White Arrow tool can select more than one point at a time by holding Shift and clicking on additional points. You can also click and drag a box out over several points to select them all at once. Alternatively, you can use the Lasso tool to draw a free-form shape that will select any points caught inside of it. That's all there is to the Lasso tool. It's not very deep. This is another post-recording addition, but I forgot to mention, in the same way that you can hold Shift to add points to your selection, you can also hold Shift to subtract points from your selection. This goes for the Black Arrow tool as well. You can hold Shift to deselect objects that you have selected. Just like the Black Arrow tool, you can also nudge these points around using the arrow keys. Holding Shift to nudge them in greater lengths also works for this tool. Unlike the Black Arrow tool, however, you cannot use the White Arrow tool to resize any objects you have selected. But you can use it to sharpen around the edges of any objects the Black Arrow tool cannot. You can select a whole object with the Black Arrow tool, then use the White Arrow tool to expose the rounding buttons. Alternatively, you can click on one corner of a shape and only round or sharpen that specific corner. You may notice that there's a group selection tool nested inside this tool if you click and hold on it, or right-click on it. We'll come back to this when we go over layer groups. Finally, you can easily access the White Arrow tool by pressing A on your keyboard. Now when you hold Control or Command, the arrow tool it changes to will be the last one you used. If I switch to another tool and held Control, this will be the arrow that comes up. But if I switch to the other arrow, then another tool, then hold Control, that arrow will be what comes up. Also, if you hold Control with one of these arrows active, it will just switch to the opposite one. Hope that didn't seem too overwhelming, especially that last section. It's important to know the ins and outs of the tools, as it will make your workflow much easier. If it helps, we can also just boil the Direct Selection tool down to, it lets you move the points on a shape. Next, we'll be tackling the Magic Wand tool.